I heard my wife tell our closest friends in my own dining room on our own anniversary that I was dead weight. Not tired, not slowing down. Dead weight. Everyone at that table went quiet in a way I'd never heard a room go quiet before, and I sat there and smiled like a man who hadn't just been gutted in front of 12 people who'd known me for 18 years. I thought that was the worst night of my life. It wasn't even close. At 11:14 that same night, my phone rang, and a woman I'd never spoken to in my life asked for me by name. Now, let me back up because you need to understand what normal looked like in my house before I tell you how it broke. My name is Everett Callahan. I'm 64 years old. I spent the first 14 years of my working life as a certified public accountant in a two-man office on Beverly Street in Staunton, Virginia, reconciling other people's numbers until I couldn't stand the smell of toner anymore. In 1994, I took what was left of my savings, $11,000, and bought a used table saw and a lease on an old feed store off Route 250. I started building furniture. Cherry dining tables. White oak sideboards. The kind of joinery you don't find anymore because it takes too long and nobody wants to pay for the hours. My father, Walton Callahan, taught me to measure twice and cut once before I could tie my own shoes. He was a land surveyor for the county for 31 years, and he kept a notebook in his breast pocket every single day of his working life, recording elevations and boundary lines in handwriting so small you needed good light to read it. When he died, he left me his folding ruler. Boxwood, brass hinges, his initials carved into the side by the pivot pin. He pressed it into my palm in the hospital 2 days before he passed and said, "This measures true even when everything else lies to you." I still carry it in my truck. I tell you all of that because it matters later. A man who spends his life measuring things does not stop noticing when something doesn't add up, even when he wishes he could stop. By last year, Callahan Woodworks had 18 employees and a shop on Coulter Street with a waiting list 8 months long. I still did the books myself every Sunday night at the kitchen table, out of habit more than necessity, because that's what my father would have expected of me, and because numbers were the one language I trusted completely. I married Renee in the spring of 1993 at a small ceremony behind her mother's house with maybe 40 people in folding chairs. For a long time, if you'd asked me, I would have told you it was the best decision I ever made. We raised 2 kids in a colonial on Churchville Avenue with green shutters and a wraparound porch. Our son Colton is 30 now, carries the title of sales director at the shop, though most days it means long lunches with clients who could probably close their own deals. Our daughter Harper is 27, teaches 3rd grade over in Waynesboro, and calls her mother most days. She calls me about once a week, usually just to ask how my hip is doing. I want you to hold on to that detail. It matters later. For months before the night I'm telling you about, I had what my cardiologist at Augusta Health called a moderate cardiac event. Not a heart attack exactly. He was careful about that word, but close enough that I spent 3 days in a hospital bed and 6 weeks afterward where I wasn't allowed to lift anything heavier than a coffee mug. I came back to the shop slower. I handed more of the floor work to Xavier Reyes, my shop foreman of 14 years. A man I trusted with the keys to that building the way I trusted almost no one else on earth. I didn't know it yet, but that hospital stay gave certain people in my life a calendar, a countdown, an excuse. The night I'm talking about was a Saturday in late September, 31 years to the day since that ceremony behind Renee's mother's house. She wanted to mark it properly, and I was glad she did. She invited about a dozen people. Pastor Doug Whitmore and his wife from Trinity Presbyterian, where we'd gone for 18 years. My sister Darlene, down from Harrisonburg. Colton and his girlfriend. Harper came alone. She'd ended things with someone that spring. And Derek Sandoval, our company's chief financial officer, a man I'd hired 9 years earlier and trusted with every number that mattered to my business, along with his wife Monica. Renee cooked a pork loin and set the table with the good china we only brought out twice a year. Candles, cloth napkins. For the first hour, it was everything an anniversary dinner should be. Pastor Doug made a toast about commitment. Darlene told an embarrassing story about our wedding day that had the whole table laughing. I sat at the head of that table with my wife of 31 years to my right, and for a little while, I let myself believe the last 4 months hadn't changed anything about my life at all. Then somebody, I think it was Monica Sandoval, asked how the transition at the shop was going. An innocent enough question. Half the people at that table knew about my heart scare, and a few had heard, correctly, that I'd been stepping back from the floor. Renee set her wine glass down and smiled the way she smiled at church. Warm on the surface, practiced underneath. "Oh, it's going," she said. "Everett's been such a trooper about it. We're really having to restructure a lot, though, since the hospital. He's just not able to carry what he used to carry." I nodded, a little uncomfortable, not alarmed yet. I even said something about how I still had plenty of sawdust left in me. That's when Renee laughed a small laugh, turned to Monica, and said the sentence I will never get out of my head as long as I live. "Honestly, some days he's just dead weight around here. But we love him anyway." The table went quiet in a way I had never heard a room go quiet before. Not the polite pause after an awkward joke. A real silence. The kind where you can hear the ice shift in somebody's glass. Pastor Doug's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Darlene's face changed so fast, I watched it happen. Harper set her napkin down on the table, slow, deliberate, the way you set something down when your hands need somewhere to go besides shaking. I looked at my wife of 31 years, and she wasn't even looking at me. She was reaching for the serving spoon, refilling Monica's plate, completely unbothered, like she'd commented on the weather. I laughed. A short, easy sound. "Well, somebody's got to carry the weight around here," I said. "Might as well be me for once." The table relaxed. Pastor Doug chuckled with relief. Darlene reached over and squeezed my arm. Under that table, where nobody could see it, my hand was shaking, and it wasn't from the heart. I didn't say another word about it the rest of the night. I helped clear plates. I walked Pastor Doug to the door. I told Renee I was tired, kissed her cheek, and went upstairs where I lay in the dark running that sentence over and over. Dead weight. But we love him anyway. At 11:14 that night, my phone lit up on the nightstand. Renee was already asleep beside me, or pretending to be. The number wasn't saved. "Mr. Callahan." A woman's voice, professional, a little rushed. "My name is Grace Aldrich. I'm calling regarding the closing documents for tomorrow morning." I sat up slow, careful not to wake Renee, and walked into the hallway before I said a word. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "Closing documents for what?" There was a pause on the line, the kind where you can hear someone's stomach drop through the phone. "Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice changing. "I think I may have the wrong understanding of where things stand. I was told you'd already been briefed on the sale terms and the consent signature needed for tomorrow's 10 o'clock closing. Is this not a good time?" I stood in that hallway in the dark, my bare feet cold on the hardwood. "Ms. Aldrich," I said, "I don't know anything about a closing tomorrow." "What sale?" "I need to go back a little further before I tell you what Grace Aldrich found, because you should know the first time something felt wrong, and I want to be honest that I brushed it off. It was back in June, 3 months before that dinner. I'd been standing in the finishing room with Xavier, going over a delivery schedule, when he mentioned, almost in passing, that Derek Sandoval had been asking him strange questions. Wanted to know what our planers and CNC router would fetch on the open market if the shop ever had to liquidate quickly. I laughed it off, told Xavier that Derek was probably just doing year-end projections. Xavier hadn't laughed. He looked at me steady and said, "Everett, I've known Derek 9 years. He doesn't ask questions like that for projections." I remembered that conversation the morning after the anniversary dinner, standing in my kitchen with the coffee going cold, staring at my phone. That feeling when you realize you've been the only one trying to hold something together while everyone else was already planning their exit. I think most people know that feeling better than they'd like to admit. I told Renee I had an early supplier meeting, which wasn't entirely a lie because I did drive into town, just not to see a supplier. I drove to see a woman named Sharon Vickers, my attorney, who kept a small office off Frederick Street. No glass lobby, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a woman who looked you in the eye when she shook your hand. I sat across from her and told her everything. The dinner, dead weight, the 11:14 phone call. Sharon listened without interrupting once, the way good lawyers do. When I finished, she said, "Everett, I need you to assume the worst is true, and let's find out together how true it is." She made 2 calls before I left her office. One to Grace Aldrich, requesting formal copies of whatever documentation had already circulated. the other to a private investigator named Nick Farrow, a quiet, careful man who ran a small firm out of Charlottesville. I want you to think hard, Sharon said, looking at me over her glasses, because in my experience, when something this big is happening, it never starts the week before. It starts months before, and the people involved get comfortable. Comfortable people leave a trail. I thought about Xavier's warning back in June. I told her about it. She wrote it down without comment, but I saw something shift in her expression. 2 days later, Xavier called me out to the shop on a pretext about equipment logs. I found him in the finishing room, sanding a walnut tabletop by hand the way he always did the final pass, no matter what the machines had already done. I told him some of what I'd learned. Not all of it. Enough. He set down his sanding block, wiped his hands on his apron, and looked at me for a long moment. Everett, he said, I've been watching Derek get cagey about the equipment numbers since June. I told you that. I didn't tell you the rest, because I wasn't sure yet, and I didn't want to throw around accusations I couldn't back up. He walked to a locked cabinet near his workbench and pulled out a small notebook, the old-fashioned kind with a rubber band around it. Inside were dates, handwritten, going back nearly a year. Every time Derek had come in asking questions that didn't add up. Every time a delivery from a supplier called Ridge Hollow Fasteners had come in overpriced compared to what Xavier knew the material should cost, from 14 years of ordering the same supplies. I kept my own records, Xavier said, quiet, steady. 14 years, Everett. I wasn't going to let somebody walk in here and take this place out from under you without at least having something written down. I stood there holding that notebook, and I thought about my father's ruler sitting in the cup holder of my truck outside. 2 men, 1 generation apart, who both believed the same thing without ever having met each other. Write it down. Measure it twice. It'll save you when nothing else will. I didn't know it yet, but Xavier's notebook was about to become the single most important piece of paper in this entire story. This is where things started to get strange, and I mean genuinely strange, in a way that made me question every conversation I'd had in the last year. Nick Farrow called me into Sharon's office on a Tuesday with a folder about 1.5 inches thick. He was a stocky, unhurried man who spoke like every word cost him something. Everett, he said, your wife has been meeting with Grace Aldridge's firm for approximately 5 months. First consultation logged in April. 11 days after your hospital admission. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. 11 days. I hadn't even finished physical therapy yet, and my wife was already sitting in a divorce attorney's office. There's more, Nick said, and he wasn't wrong. Derek Sandoval had been quietly courting a private equity group out of Richmond called Blackmere Partners for nearly a year. The plan, reconstructed from email Sharon had subpoenaed once the filing became official, was cold and straightforward. Renee would file for divorce, citing my declining health following the cardiac event. She would argue that continued joint ownership was untenable given my condition, and push for a court-approved sale of the entire company to Blackmere, which had offered $1.8 million for a business our own last appraisal put closer to $3.4 million once you counted the contracts, the client list, and the building on Coulter Street. Derek stood to receive a consulting retainer from Blackmere once the deal closed, along with a finder's fee Nick estimated at just under $140,000. I sat there and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then Nick slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. A printout of a text thread, obtained legally through discovery once things escalated, between Renee's phone and Derek's. I'm not going to describe every line to you. Some things a man keeps to himself, even when he's telling the rest of the story. But I'll tell you the timestamp on the first message that made it unmistakable. It was dated the night of a company holiday party the previous December, 11:42 p.m., for hours after I'd gone home early with a headache that turned out to be the first small warning sign of what became my heart event 3 months later. Renee had stayed at that party. So had Derek. I want to be honest about something, because people ask me this constantly. Did I cry? No. What I felt sitting in Sharon's office that afternoon wasn't the sharp, hot pain of a fresh wound. It was something slower and colder, like watching a door close from a distance. No dramatic Islam. Just a click that told you it was locked now, and it wasn't opening again. Sharon asked what I wanted to do. I told her I needed a few days. But I also told her one thing I was certain of immediately. I needed to know who else was standing on the other side of that door before I did anything at all. Harper called me that same evening, the way she does most weeks, just to check in. She asked how my hip was doing, whether I'd been getting out to the shop. I almost didn't tell her anything, but something in her voice, steady, unhurried, genuinely wanting the answer, made me change my mind. I told her some of it, carefully, the way you tell a story to someone you don't want to frighten. She went quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Dad, I need you to tell me everything right now. All of it. Because I'm not going to sit here and pretend I don't already know something's been off with Mom for months." It turned out she'd noticed things too. Small things. Renee canceling their Sunday calls more often. A new habit of taking calls in the garage with the door shut. A comment back in July about how a third-grade teacher's salary wasn't much to build a life on, followed by an odd, pointed remark about how important it was to plan ahead financially because you never really knew what could happen to a family. Harper hadn't understood it at the time. She understood it now. Colton was a different conversation, and I want to walk you through it because it matters for what happens later. I called my son 2 days after meeting with Nick and asked him directly whether he'd known anything about his mother meeting with attorneys back in April. There was a pause longer than I liked. Then Colton said, careful, in a voice I recognized from every uncomfortable conversation we'd had since he was 17. "Dad, look, Mom's just trying to protect herself, okay? Given everything with your heart, she doesn't know what's going to happen. None of us do. Honestly, maybe it's smart for everybody to have things sorted out instead of just assuming." I asked him a second question. Had he been aware of the Black Mirror offer? Another pause. Longer this time. Then he said something I will never fully forget because it told me everything I needed to know about where my son stood. "Dad, I've seen the numbers on that offer, and honestly, I think it's not a bad deal. Given the market, given that you're not really able to run things day to day the way you used to, I think you should consider it." I sat there holding the phone and asked him one more thing. Quiet, almost gentle. "Colton, did they offer you anything to keep quiet about this?" And my son, 30 years old, the boy I'd carried on my shoulders through the Blue Ridge Parkway overlooks more times than I could count, said, "Dad, that's not fair." It wasn't a no. I didn't yell at him. I want you to understand that. I told him I needed some time, and I hung up. Then I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a hardware store on Greenville Avenue for almost 40 minutes before I could bring myself to drive home. I keep that folding ruler of my father's in the cup holder of that truck. I picked it up that night and just held it for a while. It doesn't fix anything. It just reminds you what true measurement feels like when everything else around you has gone crooked. Over the following 2 weeks, Sharon and Nick built the case with a precision I found strangely comforting to watch, the way I've always found it comforting to watch a skilled craftsman work, even when the subject matter is your own marriage falling apart. Nick confirmed that Renee's 20% ownership stake had been quietly leveraged as collateral in a private loan connected to Black Mirror, structured so that if the sale fell through, she'd still be personally protected, while I'd still be personally exposed. Sharon confirmed that Derek, over the preceding 8 months, had systematically undervalued 3 separate equipment appraisals submitted to our insurance carrier, likely to make the eventual sale price to Black Mirror look reasonable on paper. A discrepancy that, once documented, amounted to insurance fraud on top of everything else. And Nick, working Xavier's notebook like it was a roadmap, traced Ridge Hollow Fasteners back to its state filings. The company turned out to be registered to Derek's brother-in-law, with a business address that was actually a mailbox rental store off Greenville Avenue. The total, once Nick finished reconstructing it, came to just over $68,000 over 19 months. I sat with that for a long time. $68,000 is not nothing. Not to a man who started his business with $11,000 and a used table saw. But it wasn't the money that kept me up at night. It was picturing Renee sitting in Grace Aldridge's office 11 days after I woke up in that hospital bed, already deciding what my declining condition was worth to her in a settlement. I drove out to the shop on a Thursday afternoon, told the front office I needed to review some equipment logs, and found Xavier in the finishing room again, sanding another tabletop by hand. I told him more of what I'd learned. Not everything yet, but enough. He set down his sanding block and looked at me for a long moment. Everett, he said, I didn't keep that notebook for a piece of anything. I kept it because you're my friend, and because this shop is the only place I've ever worked where somebody actually taught me the right way to do something instead of just the fast way. I told him I knew that. That's exactly why what I was about to do mattered to me. I sat him down right there on an overturned crate and told him I wanted to restructure the company's ownership once this was behind us. 12% outright, no loan, no conditions, effective the day everything's settled. 14 years of loyalty, I told him, is worth more than 12%, but it's what I could offer, and I wanted him standing beside me in that business for as long as he'd have me. Xavier didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then he said, quiet, in a voice thicker than I'd ever heard from him, Everett, I didn't do any of that for a piece of the company. I know, I said. That's exactly why I'm doing it anyway. I called Harper that same week and told her everything. All of it, start to finish. The affair, the fraud, the timeline, the $68,000, the offer from Blackmere, Colton's answer about the finder's fee. She was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then she said something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Dad, I don't care about any of the money. I just need you to know that whatever happens, I'm not going anywhere. And I never was. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to test exactly how true that was, because I had one more move to make, and it required every single person in this story to be sitting in the same room at the same time. I asked Renee to sit down with me on a Sunday evening in early November, told her I want to talk about where things stood between us calmly, like adults, before either of us said anything to a judge. I asked her to invite Derek and Monica too. Told her I wanted to clear the air about some business concerns before they became a bigger issue, since Derek was still, as far as she knew, unaware that anything had been discovered. I told Colton the same thing. Framed it as a chance for the family to talk honestly before things got messy in court. And I asked Harper to come quietly and to bring nothing but herself. They all arrived that Sunday, believing they were walking into a negotiation. Renee wore the same composed, practiced expression she'd worn the night of the anniversary dinner. Derek shook my hand at the door with the easy confidence of a man who thought he still had the upper hand. Monica brought a bottle of wine, completely unaware of what her husband had been doing for the better part of 2 years. Colton sat down at the same table where he'd once done his homework under my supervision, and looked at me with the careful, guarded expression of someone bracing for terms he thought he already understood. I let everyone settle in. I poured coffee, and then Sharon Vickers, who'd been waiting quietly in my study, walked into the dining room carrying a single folder and sat down at the head of the table across from me. Renee's face changed the second she saw her. I watched it happen in real time, the practiced composure cracking at the edges, the way a windshield cracks before it shatters. I kept my voice level. I want to be clear about that because people ask me this constantly. I never raised my voice once that entire evening. Renee, I said, 11 days. That's how long it took you to consult a divorce attorney after I woke up in that hospital bed. Derek, 11 days before you started building a case to sell my company out from under me, while you and Blackmere worked out what you'd personally walk away with. Monica set her wine glass down slowly, looking at her husband with an expression I recognized immediately because I'd worn it myself 6 weeks earlier at my own anniversary table. Derek, she said. What was he talking about? Derek didn't answer her because Sharon had already opened the folder and started laying documents across the table, one at a time. Calm, methodical, unstoppable. The text messages, dated and time-stamped, going back 14 months. The insurance appraisal discrepancies, side by side with the real equipment value Xavier had documented in that worn little notebook with the rubber band. The vendor invoices from Ridge Hollow Fasteners, registered to Derek's own brother-in-law. $68,000 over 19 months. And finally, the referral letter to the Augusta County Commonwealth's attorney, already filed, already logged, dated 4 days earlier. Renee's hands were shaking by the time Sharon finished, laying everything out. Everett, she said, her voice thin, please, we can talk about this. We can figure something out. I looked at my wife of 31 years, and I said the only thing I had left to say to her. Renee, you call me dead weight at our own anniversary dinner, in front of our pastor, in front of my sister, in front of people who have known us for 18 years. And then you went home that same night and let your attorney's office believe I already knew I was being sold out of my own company. I'm not angry that you wanted out of this marriage. People grow apart. I understand that better than you think. I'm telling you calmly that I will not let you walk out of it with my life's work in your other hand. Derek tried to speak, tried to reach for some version of the smooth, confident tone he used to talk his way through vendor meetings. There was nothing smooth left in that room for him to reach for. Monica stood up first, picked up her purse, and walked out without another word. I watched something in Derek's face fully collapse when he realized his own wife wasn't going to sit there and help him talk his way out of it. Colton hadn't said a word this entire time. I turned to him last. "Son," I said, "I asked you a question 2 weeks ago, whether they'd offered you anything to stay quiet. You didn't answer me. I'm going to give you one more chance to answer it now, in front of everyone." My son sat there for a long moment. Then, quiet, his voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, he said, "They offered me $80,000, Dad, once the sale closed, for not making waves. I just sat there because I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to say no to Mom. I told myself it wasn't really hurting you, that it was just business." I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. "Colton," I said, "it wasn't just business. It was my life. And you knew that. I want to tell you what happened over the following weeks, because this is where the sweetness of this story lies. And I promised myself a long time ago I wouldn't tell a story that was only about what I took away from people. That's not the man I want to be, even after everything." The Augusta County Commonwealth's Attorney's Office moved forward with charges against Derek Sandoval for embezzlement and insurance fraud. Derek was terminated from Callahan Woodworks effective immediately. His name was stripped from every account, every vendor relationship, every piece of paperwork that had ever carried his signature. The Blackmere sale collapsed entirely once their legal team learned about the pending fraud investigation, which suited me fine because I had never once wanted to sell that business. Not for $1.8 million, not for $3.4 million, not for any number a stranger in Richmond could put on paper. Renee and I finalized our divorce 3 months later. I want to be honest with you about the settlement, because people always ask. Under Virginia law, and with the documented fraud and infidelity on the record, Sharon was able to negotiate a settlement far more modest than the one Renee had originally been counting on when she walked into Grace Aldridge's office 11 days after my heart event. She kept the house on Churchville Avenue because I didn't want it anymore anyway. Too many rooms. Too many memories of a table where I'd been called dead weight. I kept full ownership and control of Callahan Woodworks, restructured with Xavier, now holding a genuine 12% stake and a title that finally matched what he'd been doing for 14 years. Shop partner and operations manager. Colton and I still talk occasionally. Carefully. The way two people talk when trust has to be rebuilt one small, honest conversation at a time instead of assumed the way it used to be. He's not in the business anymore. I told him, gently, that I needed people around me I never had to wonder about. I think, somewhere underneath the shame, he understood that. That feeling when you realize you've been explaining yourself to someone who already decided not to understand you. I don't think I need to explain that one. Most people already know it in their bones. Harper is the reason I still believe in the good in people, and I want to spend a moment telling you what I did for her, because she is the sweet part of this story, and every story like mine ought to have one. 2 weeks after that Sunday evening at the dining room table, I sat down with Sharon and restructured my will and my personal holdings entirely. I set up an irrevocable trust in Harper's name, funded with the proceeds from the eventual sale of the Churchville Avenue house, along with a 10% ownership stake in the company itself, held separately from daily operations, so that no matter what happens to me, she has something real and permanent that no one can ever quietly maneuver away from her while she isn't looking. I also paid off her student loans in full quietly that same week, because when I'd asked her months earlier whether she'd known anything about her mother's plans, she'd said the only thing she cared about was that I knew she wasn't going anywhere. I wanted her to know I'd heard that, and I wanted to answer it the way it deserved to be answered. I still go into the shop most mornings now. Slower than I used to. My hips still ache a little by the end of a long day, but I stand at that workbench beside Xavier, and we build things together the way we always have. There's a peace in that shop now I hadn't felt in a long time before all of this happened, because everyone standing in it actually wants to be there. I kept my father's folding ruler in the cup holder of my truck through all of it. Boxwood, brass hinges, his initials carved by the pivot pin. I took it out the night Sharon laid those documents across my dining room table, and I held it in my pocket the entire time. It didn't do anything. It didn't need to. It just reminded me what true measurement feels like when everything else has gone crooked. I think about that anniversary dinner sometimes. The candles. The china we only use twice a year. The sentence that broke something open in me that I didn't know was still fragile enough to break. Dead weight, but we love him anyway. I understand now that she never meant the second half of that sentence at all. But I think about Xavier's worn little notebook with a rubber band around it, and Harper's voice on the phone telling me she wasn't going anywhere. And I understand something else too. Something I don't think I ever would have learned if that phone hadn't rung at 11:14 that night. The people who are actually going to carry you when it matters are rarely the ones sitting closest to you at the table. Sometimes they're the ones quietly keeping records in a locked cabinet 14 years before you ever need them. Or the ones who call you every week just to ask how your hip is doing, expecting nothing back at all. Write it down. Measure it twice. It's the only thing I know that never once lied to me. I'm 64 years old. I've still got plenty of years of work left in these hands, hip or not. I built something once out of $11,000 in a used table saw, and I built it again, quieter and steadier, out of a $68,000 lesson about who actually deserves a seat at your table. If you've ever found out the hard way who was really in your corner, I'd like to know. Was it a friend nobody expected? A coworker? A child who surprised you? Tell me who it was for you.